To us it just looks like a lemon, a meandering collection of thoughts on movement. By Holly Graham. What looks to be a piece of fruit, with half a sour orange and a little burnt alum, expels all the putrescence and pus from the gums, loose teeth and stinking breath. No medicine, nor apothecary's drug, the essential remedies. What looks to be a piece of fruit. The lemon, that puckered lip-inducing yellow fruit, has begun to float as a motif of sorts through a body of work I've been developing in recent years. I first registered it clasped curiously in the hand of a porcelain sweetmeats figurine held within the V&A Museum's collections, at the onset of embarking on my now ongoing research into histories and legacies of sugar. It surfaced again while combing through press cuttings at Southwark Local History Library a couple of years back, in the form of candied peel churned out by Bermondsey factories in the late 19th century. I liked its form, its texture and weight. Here is a collection of sliced half-moon segments and glittering crimp-lined crescent rinds, and there as a palm-sized globular fruit with pinch-stretched poles. I mapped the two references onto each other in visual and textual studio experiments, and began to look further back at its presence amidst colonial seafaring exploits, adopted alongside other citrus fruits as a cure for sailors' scurvy, bobbing on the turbulent waves of naval histories that went on to form empires. Last year, I was invited to take up a residency at Southwark Park Galleries as part of a project commemorating the 400-year anniversary of the Mayflower. In 1620, Puritans and accompanying strangers boarded the ship together on a stretch of the river just a stone's throw away from the gallery in Rotherhithe. And now, centuries later, the project sought to critically retrace the vessel's narrative as a point of departure for considering migration in a contemporary context. Before the residency, my knowledge of the Mayflower was minimal. I was aware of it only peripherally, as the birthing of the Thanksgiving story, with all of the myth and contradiction it carries, a celebration of the putting down of roots of one group of people at the expense of the survival of indigenous populations, the birthing of a new nation on occupied land that would espouse ideas of universal freedoms while subjugating and exploiting others. The threads of movement and colonialism woven through previous citrus-studied research seemed inextricably tied to the European expansionist ideals that laid the foundations to enable the relocation of the Plymouth Pilgrims in 1620. So when invited to take up the residency at Southwark Park Galleries, I thought of lemons. The lemon as we know it today is a hybrid of other pre-existing species of citrus fruits. Originating in Southeast Asia, it is now grown around the world, including throughout the Mediterranean and South and Central America. The fragrant, thick-skinned fruit has travelled widely and has a multitude of stories to tell. The symbolic value projected onto the lemon is broad. While speaking of the V&A's fruit-grasping sugar bowl figure, a museum guide told me of the lemon's associations with wealth and fertility, emblematic of the bitterness encountered when one overindulges in luxury, and serving, like other fruits, as a signifier of both harvest and plenty alongside transience and mortality. To us, it just looks like a lemon, she told me. According to Google, Catholicism projects fidelity and faithfulness onto it too. There is documented discussion over possible cures for scurvy dating back as far as the mid-16th century, and knowledge of the virtues of lemons and oranges by the end of the 1500s. Many of these early accounts and recommendations are from Portuguese and Spanish merchants, reflecting the naval supremacy of the two powers, who initially led the way in Europe's expansionist ambitions. But as it turns out, according to food historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, the employment of citrus as a remedy was not widely used at this point due to issues of supply, storage and expense. We know from records that after a 2-month-long blustery journey on the Mayflower, followed by a winter on board the docked ship, only half of those who set out remained, likely due to a combination of scurvy, pneumonia and tuberculosis. With depleted resources at the outset and a lengthy crossing ahead of them, perhaps it is unlikely that the Mayflower pilgrims would have had many a lemon at their disposal. In these early stages of research, while the loose threads I'd used to draw together the citrus and the Mayflower narrative began to slacken, I continued to reflect on the tangled relationship between food and movement, and to consider the entry points into conversation offered by traversing the common ground subject of eating. As such, the residency would find itself, much like this text does, threaded through with bite-sized segues and tangents, morsels of culinary information, tying my preoccupation with food to thoughts around migration. I thought about dinner tables as spaces of collective sharing, forums for exchange, conversation and storytelling. I thought about the potential of food and movement to feed each other. I thought about the familiarity of seeing consumable vegetable matter day to day in our supermarket aisles, quotidian and simple, and yet each imbued with stories and histories of their own that may offer tangible ways into thinking and talking about pasts and presents of place. To us, it just looks like a lemon. Sea legs. The Plymouth Pilgrims, as they came to be known, were not the first English arrivals to endeavour to establish colonies on American soil. Their act was predated by the famed first permanent settlement in what is now known as the USA, Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607, and by several foiled efforts before that, including that of the lost colony of Roanoke in 1585. Notably, albeit tangentially, the beloved potato that has formed such a staple of the British and Irish diet, a fundamental ingredient in both shepherd's and cottage pies, in stews and roasts, the mash to our bangers, the chips to our fish, was introduced to this here soil by one of these early exploits. Sir Walter Raleigh, the English explorer who headed up the Roanoke expedition, is credited with introducing the humbled potato to these isles. He obtained a charter from Elizabeth I to discover, search, find out, and view, and furthermore, to have, hoard, occupy, and enjoy, what the text refers to as such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands, countries, and territories, not actually possessed of any Christian prince, nor inhabited by Christian people. While he is said not to have actually visited North America himself, he funded multiple expeditions of this kind. Unlike those self-titled adventurers and merchants who went before, the Puritans might instead be better understood as religious refugees, driven by their separatist ideals, first to the Netherlands, and then, when the hand of the English state stretched out beyond the nation's borders to reach them there, onwards across the Atlantic. The written testimony of Puritan William Bradford tells us that their journey was not an easy one, but the way ahead was prepared for them by those earlier European forays into the New World and the disease it brought with it, the land cleared in advance of their arrival by the subsequent deaths of many of its previous Native American inhabitants. It is to practice an act of partial or selective study, negligent and violent in its omissions, to consider the Mayflower story without taking in a view through a wider lens of broader colonial contexts at the heart of the formation of what we now know as the USA, self-appointed land of the free and home of the brave. While the ambitions of the Puritans in their pursuit of religious freedoms may be viewed as modest, their movements exist within a wider frame of entitled colonial conquest and exploitation that cannot be ignored. Indeed, they sailed with the Virginia Company, with the aim of settling, had they not been blown off course, in the northern part of the already established Virginia colony. It is perhaps worth noting, in view of this wider context, that just a year before the Mayflower touched down, the first enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of the Virginia settlement. Delivered on a British privateer ship, the 20 or so captured individuals had been seized from a Spanish or Portuguese vessel, reports differ, carrying many more to the Caribbean, an enforced displacement of people, and the beginning of a new, racialised, highly oiled, and economically efficient form of slavery that would go on to shape the building of a new nation. In these early days of empire, attempts were also made to enslave indigenous Americans, and indentured European labour was also employed. The Mayflower sailed, therefore, at a time of expansive and exploitative European power building, colonial strategies that operated through active settlement drives and forced migrations. For the Pilgrims' own part, although their early relationship with neighbouring indigenous communities was cordial, it soon took on the forceful character and style of aggressive colonial expansion. Purchasing of additional land from the local Pokanoket people shifted just half a century after the sailing of the Mayflower into an active purging of the land of its people through warfare and enslavement. It is estimated that during King Philip's War of 1675 to 78, the Plymouth colony sold over 500 indigenous people into slavery. The later success of the colony for its Puritan inhabitants can also be seen as inextricably linked to the wider context of English colonial settlement through the two-way food-based trade that operated between Plymouth colony and the West Indies. Fish, timber, grain and cattle in exchange for sugar and rum produced via slave labour. These complexities and dualities complicate singular narratives of a people's triumph over adversity, of a harmonious mutuality between the settlers and the surrounding indigenous populations, and of the pursuit of freedom. The wider picture pokes holes in the swollen narrative of Thanksgiving, calling into question reenactments of celebratory feasting that remembers historical gains and masks human losses. It strikes me that there's a peculiar contradiction in the Western fear of mass migration, an irrational terror of immigrant takeover that is more reflective of the damaging colonial pursuits of European powers between the 15th and 19th centuries than of the realities of any actual movement of groups of people today. From conservative threats of a nigger for your neighbour with a vote for Labour in the 1960s to contemporary warnings of cockroaches and swarms, a wild fear-mongering regarding the movement of others is pervasive in British political and media rhetoric. This signals towards a troubled and unresolved relationship to movement and migration in Britain, a hypocritical double standard that governs who is entitled to freedom of movement, and an inability to reconcile historical actions of the nation that have shaped its contemporary positioning as a potential home for people all over the world. When I think of contemporary experiences of migration, I think of the language of expat versus immigrant. I think of right-to-work status and the poverty-driven sickness and death caused by its withdrawal. I think of border crossings. I think of Calais and Dunkirk and news images of small, dangerously overcrowded boats. I think of Windrush and its more recent corresponding scandal. I think of my wonderful, bold Auntie Babs, a curious linguist who lived for years at a time in Japan and Kenya. I think of friendships forged on my MA course with artists on international student visas that have garnered me a worldwide network of creative collaborators dotted between Paris, Singapore, Madrid, Chile, Shetland, Cyprus and more. And I think of Brexit and the hostile environment policy. Sugar in the blood. When I was invited to take up this residency, critically retracing the Mayflower narrative as a point of departure for considering migration in a contemporary context, I hesitated. Needless to say, migration and its contemporary context spans a vast range of experiences that are not my own, and I felt overwhelmed by the potential breadth of the task at hand. Even my own experiences of migration are not quite my own. They are cousins once or twice removed, a collective history rather than a singular act. In conversations around diaspora, I have always been confused about whether I am classed as a second or third generation immigrant. I believe the reality is that I'm somewhere in between. My father came to England from Jamaica in 1966 at the age of 7, along with his 2 older siblings, aged 8 and 10. Not on the Windrush itself, but in its wake, not by sea, but by air. They were summoned to join their parents who'd answered the call of the mother country in years prior. Grandma Cynthia in 1964 and Grandad William in 1961, a teacher and a tailor stitching together new lives in a cold Britain. My mother was born here, in South London, in 1958, but her Bajan parents had also answered the Windrush call 2 years earlier, in 1956, and set to work in British society, my granny Vera in schools as a dinner lady and in the NHS as a nurse, and my grandfather Leon as a carpenter. These movements, locked into my family history, though relatively recent, might easily become lost in translation between generations, muted with details untold or forgotten. A few years back, in fear of the potential of generational amnesia, I instigated a project of opening up conversations with my family members to trouble stuffy silences and eke out space within them for voicing previously unanswered questions and listening for responses. What came forth sounded, to me at least, like a sigh. An exhalation of tension, a releasing of kept personal knowledge. The series of oral history interviews were conducted in pairs, threes, and sometimes more, where family curiosity peaked and bubbled over into determined sit-ins. Grandad William's interview, along with his 3 sons, garnered a whole audience of partners and grandchildren eager to hear the measured words of this serious and guarded man, whose upbringing and motivations we realised we knew very little about. The conversations provoked an unravelling of names and pet names, lost and found siblings, lost and found mothers, adopted parents, and cross-generational care, knitted together and suspended in the frothy web of transatlantic crossings. The roots and roots intertwined in this Caribbean heritage are sticky. Andrea Stewart writes of sugar in the blood, a channeling of further histories of enforced migration through enslavement of West Africans, indentured labour of Chinese, Indian and Irish migrants, and the extermination of indigenous communities of the Americas, all driven by a European sweet tooth for the wealth and power that colonial expansion and mass cane sugar production yielded. Legacies of these events are evidenced in British culinary culture, in afternoon tea, puddings, biscuits and jam on toast. These movements of people are baked into Bajan rum-soaked fruitcake, kneaded into Trinidadian paratha roti, or bus-up shut, as it is often called, and stirred through Jamaican Guinness punch. That the curve of the narrative arc later drew subjects of these far-flung islands to the small country that provoked many of these initial movements is then not wholly remarkable. As social theorist Stuart Hall noted of the relocated individuals of Britain's former colonies, "We are here because you were there." Galling, then, for these former colonial subjects, after responding to calls to fight and work for Britain, after rivers of blood and decades of staying power, to be met with the Windrush scandal, and this amidst a wider climate of the hostile environment, a closed-door policy for many individuals who today exercise their human right to free movement, out of choice or necessity, at a time of global conflict, displacement, and economic, health, and environmental crisis. This legacy of sugar leaves a bitter taste in the mouth. Stir to fully incorporate. In a mirroring of the combined assemblage of fragmentary thoughts, associations, and references that framed my initial response to Southwark Park Galleries' invite, my plan for the month-long residency involved a veritable stew of assorted activities. I would make a second home of the beautiful Sands Films Image Library in Rotherhithe, itself housed within a former 18th century grain warehouse, with rafters fashioned from reclaimed ship timbers. There I searched for images of food transportation on the docks, and sugar production both locally and further afield. There were ideas for a film, which now, following a year of gestation, is beginning to take shape within another project. I would visit the museum of local former biscuit factory, Peak Freens, and interview one of the museum's two custodians, Frank, about the site and its relationship to wider stories of trade and food production in Bermondsey. At one time known as the Larder of London and positioned on the Thames, the area was a hot spot for the processing of imported and exported goods. The Peak Freens Museum is housed on the former site of the factory, and although its footprint remains largely intact, the museum itself is confined to a smallish 3-room unit within one of its blocks. The Victorian buildings now house a climbing wall, cafe, meeting rooms, and artist studios. In the vein of such industrial park developments, it has held a small part of its past in the names of the buildings, calling them cocoa, almond, bourbon, and jam studios, to name but a few. The site itself is listed on workspace.co.uk as the Biscuit Factory. Frank, a former long-standing employee, spoke of the workers' community and of the impact of the factory's closure on the local area. He traced the company's origins from its early days of producing ship's biscuits through to innovating developments of sweet treats, shaped in moulded forms that have become imprinted on the national consciousness. The custard cream, the Garibaldi, and the Bourbon are now household names. Back at the gallery, I would initiate workshops on recipe sharing, inviting participants to share favoured dishes or sugary snacks from home, wherever that may be. In a workshop with locally based college Bosco Centre, we started with lemonade. We concocted a spiced version, somewhere between Delia's homespun recipe and my mum's sorrel, a syrupy, wine-coloured, hibiscus flower cold brew, infused with cinnamon and ginger and often spiked with rum. Variations on the theme are found in different parts of the Caribbean. We mixed the lemonade collectively in the gallery, multiple hands at work, a chopping team, a grating team, a squeezing team, a combining team. It was an almost frantic communal act. Many of the students on the EFL course are in the midst of navigating the arduous process of seeking asylum in the UK. The activity broke the shy quiet of the class, and Sudanese, Eritrean, Pakistani, Vietnamese, and English tongues knitted together in the air. Perhaps everyone was a little confused about why we were drinking lemonade in an empty gallery, but there was something satisfying about sipping this collaboratively produced refreshment together, and it served as an entry point for inviting those present to share their own recipes. We went on to create a photocopied cookbook zine. It was an ambitious task for the time, and the group left with their teacher clutching stacks of unbound pages with a promise to finish them off later. And that would have been it, but the students extended the project in the weeks that followed, cooking from their new books in the college kitchen. I was invited to join their lunchtime meal, and it was a joy. The reserve displayed in the gallery had dissipated, and here in their own space, they were at ease, bubbly, teasing, and eager to welcome a visitor. That day, young people from Eritrea led the cooking of injera and lentil stew. They shared tips and suggestions and argued over the best approaches, though for several of them, this was their first attempt at making the familiar dish themselves. The sense of achievement and delight at sharing this with their classmates was palpable. In the following weeks, they would continue to work their way through the book. Next time, Vietnamese chicken and tomato and egg coffee. I found on the residency that a month was not a long time at all. I was grateful for the flexibility and responsiveness of Southwark Park Galleries, allowing time where more was needed, and being open to shifting formats as the project evolved. Plans morphed from possibilities of screening events into lunchtime zine launches and onto this reflective text, which attempts to draw together some of the seemingly disparate strands of interest touched on in my time in the Bothy. Many of the conversations had during that time form the beginnings of new project strands that I am continuing to develop today, as part of an art practice that is sticky, lumpy, and fluid in consistency. A muddy cocktail of lemons, sugar, potatoes, roti, sorrel, Guinness, injera, and more. To Us It Just Looks Like a Lemon is commissioned by Southwark Park Galleries and generously supported by the Southwark Mayflower 400 Grants Fund from Southwark Council, British Land and United St Saviour's.